Dawn cut across the driveway in a thin, clinical line. Violet killed the engine and checked the dashboard clock. 6:02 a.m. The pale numbers felt accusatory. She took a breath that tasted like coffee and careful plans, swung the car door open, and pulled the suitcase handle like a ritual. Years of overtime, spreadsheets, and careful transfers, all folded into a soft, navy suitcase with a fraying handle. On the porch, her mother stood framed in the doorway, a small suitcase beside her, cheeks flushed with fake cheer. For a beat, Violet believed everything about this morning would be exactly as she'd imagined: thumbprints on brochures, shared laughter over airport donuts, a tiny ceremonial clink of champagne glasses in a boutique hotel. Then her sister appeared. Lauren moved like she owned the scene, fashionably casual, hair catching the light, a suitcase identical to Violet's in size if not in intention. She carried a smile that had always worked better as armor than warmth. Violet's throat closed. The distance between them became a physical thing. The space where a shared history should sit felt empty. "Change of plans," Mom chirped, voice too bright. "Lauren's coming instead. She's been so stressed, she really needs a break." Violet's hand tightened around the suitcase handle. Every spreadsheet cell, every late-night search for the perfect rooftop restaurant, all the hours she'd set aside for this single moment, stacked in her chest like unpaid bills. "I paid for everything," Violet said. The words were precise, brittle. Mom's eyes moved away, practiced. "We're grateful, sweetheart, but you work so hard. You can go another time. Lauren needs this now." Lauren leaned against the doorframe as if she'd rehearsed the casual entitlement. "Thanks, sis. You're a lifesaver," she offered, thin gratitude like tissue paper. Violet opened her mouth and closed it again. The driveway became a stage, and she the understudy, learning her lines too late. Her father shuffled out with a duffel, avoiding her gaze, his presence an uncomfortable punctuation to the scene. An old photograph of family holiday dinners flashed across Violet's mind, where she'd always sat quietly at the edge, refilling plates, cutting pies, smoothing arguments. No one had ever asked if she wanted to be seen. She forced a smile that felt like a mask glued to her face. "Get going then," she said, voice even. It sounded performed, and it was. She lifted her suitcase to the trunk and clicked it shut with hands that did not tremble until the latch sealed. The drive to the airport was a map of silence. Lauren's chattering barged in like it didn't belong to Violet's morning at all. TikTok dreams of Parisian shopping lists, plans to try every gelato flavor, the easy assumption that everything would fall into place. Her parents laughed like the punchline was correct. Violet watched the lines of the road slide by like paragraphs she had already written. When she helped them unload, her mother hugged her in a way that made the bones in Violet's chest ache, gentle but dismissive. "We're so thankful," Mom said, and the words seemed aimed at the cardboard cutout of a daughter who'd never complain. Violet watched them go, felt the smallness of her own plan collapsing into a suitcase left in the trunk, and let silence for the first time sit like an answer. She didn't chase them to the check-in desk. She walked back to the car, sat in the driver's seat, and opened the laptop she always used for careful things. The glow made her face look exhausted and electric. A single click began the kind of quiet violence only the overlooked know how to perform. Confirmations deleted, rooms released, tours unbooked. Each cancellation felt like a small, necessary theft, a repossession of agency. Outside, the morning turned bright. Inside, Violet's hands moved steady and cold, as if she were closing chapters rather than slamming doors. She didn't know yet whether this would be the end of something or the start of a different life. But for the first time, she let the suitcase sit closed beside her car, its zipper shut on a future someone else had tried to take. The notifications began as polite tremors, texts piling like a tide. Violet left her phone face down in the cup holder and drove home through streets that felt both ordinary and alien. She could have compounded the silence, could have let the day blur into work and routine, but there was a hunger beneath her ribs that wouldn't be smothered by pretending nothing had happened. At home, she made tea with deliberate slowness. The kettle's whistle was a private metronome. She didn't answer immediately when the first call came through. Instead, she watched sunlight slice across the kitchen tiles and thought of all the small sacrifices that had brought her to this point: the overtime shifts, missed dinners, the way she had learned to put other people's comfort ahead of her own. Each memory sharpened the taste of resentment into something less aimless: determination. The first voicemail from her mother trembled with panic: hotel refused, reservation missing. Lauren's voice followed, syrupy with outrage. "You can't do this, Violet. Fix it." The words snapped like fragile glass. Violet could feel the old roles settle around her like dust: fixer, arranger, family quiet. She imagined her parents wandering through strange hotel lobbies, asking for a name that no longer existed on any list. When she finally called back, it was with a calm that felt deliberate. "I canceled the reservations," she said. The click of a pen in the background on the other end sounded frantic. The phone filled with a chorus of disbelief, entitlement, and accusations, words her ears had memorized: petty, humiliation, weird, unfair. Her father's voice, when it came, tried a different tack: reason. "This isn't like you," he said. That phrase had been a mirror her entire life, reflecting back an identity she'd always accepted. Violet felt the old reflex rise to soothe, explain, fold back into place. But this time she inhaled and let the reflex die on its own. "You chose Lauren," she said simply. "I won't fund something I'm not part of." There it was, lucidity dressed as defiance. It was both smaller and larger than she'd expected. Guilt did not fall upon her. Instead, there was a peculiar lightness, the kind that follows a release from a tight grip. She shelved the phone and opened an old folder labeled Trip Plan, as if to see the architecture of the dream she'd been building. Dates, reservations, little notes, a private symphony of generosity. She sat with it for a long time, not in regret but in appraisal, as if considering whether to turn the music inward for herself. Grace called that afternoon, boots and voice in equal measure. "How's the rebellion?" she asked, sitting cross-legged on Violet's couch with 2 coffees and a dangerous grin. Grace understood boundary as a verb, not a polite suggestion. She sipped, watching Violet with an expression that was part pride, part concern. "It hurts," Violet said. Truth had a way of making itself small when spoken aloud, but it also made the space around it honest. "Not just today. All the times." Grace nodded, non-judgmental. "Then don't fold. Let them figure it out. They're adults." The following day, texts escalated into a staccato of calls. Sometimes anger, sometimes shame, sometimes pleas. Violet answered when she wanted to, left it ringing when she didn't. In the quiet hours, she found rituals to anchor herself: lunch at a small cafe where the owner knew her name, a long walk where she watched strangers carry pieces of their lives on their shoulders with a nonchalance Violet was only learning to mimic. Each small act of ordinary independence knitted her feeling back together. The family's drama boiled into a public, messy thing when she finally answered a video call. Her mother's face filled the screen, red-rimmed eyes, desperate posture. Lauren loomed behind, a half-defensive, half-entitled glare. Her father's jaw was tight. The conversation was a messy braid of accusations and half-tender moments. Violet sat across from them, not shrinking but not shouting either. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "You made your choice," she said. "I made mine." It was a small sentence. It carried an irrevocable weight. On the other side, something fragile and familiar cracked. The family began to flail through apologies that felt sewn from other people's scripts. Violet listened, catalogued, but did not let the fabric pull her back. That night she dreamt of suitcases, some filled with clothes, others with old expectations, rolling away down a long corridor. She woke with the sound of the kettle and a stubborn resolve: if she'd been invisible for years, the next chapters would be written with her name at the top. The cancellations were only the beginning. Once the initial shock wore off, the family's response mutated from anger into something more insidious: bargaining. Messages shifted tone from accusation to negotiation, offers to split costs, promises to make it up to her, invitations to family dinners proffered with a timidity previously unseen. They'd roped in friends, apologized in public, scribbled out the edges of their guilt with gestures that felt like tax deductions for conscience. Violet didn't accept immediate appeasement. She listened to the offers and let them hang in the air like unpaid invoices. There was a moment, the sort that resembled a fuse flickering, when Lauren left a voice message halfway between apology and demand. Maybe I could, pay the hotels? I can Venmo you. The flippant tone was a sting. Instead of anger, Violet felt something like curiosity. The years of smoothing and making everything palatable had taught her how to read intentions. Lauren's offer was performative. Her parents' guilt was performative. They were practicing remorse the way one practices a speech. Violet decided to test them, not out of cruelty, but out of a need to see whether change was real or merely theatrical. She set a condition. If they wanted the trip rebooked the way she had mapped it, they would have to sit down with her and listen. Not to defend, not to explain, but to hear. It was a small, steadfast demand, harder than it seemed because listening requires slowing down, and privilege always thrived in speed. Her father balked. Her mother cried. Lauren called her dramatic. But the dialogue shifted. Nobody had ever asked them to pay attention like that. When they finally agreed, reluctantly, the sitting was not cinematic. It took place at Violet's kitchen table, cups of black coffee steaming, a notebook open between them like a fragile treaty. Violet's mother kept her eyes lowered, fingers tracing the rim of the mug. Her father tried to interject at first, but Violet held the room with a quiet gravity that demanded attention. She spoke in small stories rather than grand accusations, times when she'd rearranged her life to accommodate others, moments that had corroded her sense of worth. For each story she offered a detail, a missed graduation, an unpaid babysitting night, a birthday quietly rescheduled, and watched how those details landed. Sometimes they hardened into defensive walls. Sometimes, unexpectedly, they softened. Lauren's face shifted through expressions Violet hadn't seen before, defiance thinning into discomfort, a flash of guilt, then an uneasy apology. Her mother's voice broke once and twice. Her father's posture changed from avoidance to the awkward unease of a man learning that love sometimes required more than silent support. The meeting didn't end in absolution. It ended messy, with promises that felt lightly tethered to the truth. But something fundamental had altered. The family had been forced to see Violet as an entity with needs, rather than an invisible insurance policy in case things went sideways. That evening Violet opened a fresh spreadsheet, not to plan for them, but to plan for herself. Line items read like permissions, solo trip ideas, a photography class, a list of small luxuries she'd never allowed herself. The act of writing rewired possibility into something she could touch. She booked a modest solo getaway, not Italy, not yet, the kind of trip that felt like a practice in being the center of her own story. As the departure date approached, she felt a strange alchemy at work, anger tempered into clarity. The world beyond the family drama looked wider and whole. She began to recognize her own voice, at first a whisper and then a clear, audible line threading through her days. The midpoint had shifted not in the form of dramatic revenge, but as the radical choice to reorient her life toward herself. That decision, small and sovereign, was the true twist. The antagonist had not been only her family's neglect, but the years of quiet compliance she'd allowed. On the morning she left, Violet zipped the bag that had once been a symbol of other people's vacations. This time she felt the weight differently, less like debt, more like ballast. She walked out the door with her passport and a list of goals written on the back of a hotel receipt. It felt audacious and tender all at once. Italy arrived like an impossible postcard, a ribbon of cobblestone streets, a sky that seemed to be filmed on purpose, strangers' laughter spilling from cafes. Violet felt momentarily unmoored, an honest disorientation that felt good. In Rome, she traded her caution for curiosity, and the city rewarded her with small, luminous moments, a pastry so warm it made her eyes water, a conversation with a florist who taught her how to pronounce a name with delight. Back home, the family's messages continued but softened into a background noise she could tune out. Her parents sent pictures of hotel rooms, text threads that tried to stitch mistakes back together with promises. Violet read them without responding. The world she'd left behind felt like a house one could visit but not live in. Mid-trip, something unexpected happened. On a slow afternoon in Florence, rain turning the Arno opaque and reflective, Violet met a woman painting at the edge of a bridge. She had pain under her thumb and laughter in her voice, and she asked Violet to sit. The two spoke without haste about art, fear, and how it felt to choose oneself. The painter's life was an open defiance, full of mistakes and abandoned plans and an enviable joy that had nothing to do with other people's approval. Violet listened, then began to speak in a voice that surprised her, clear, unapologetic, alive. The conversation landed like a bell. Violet realized the trip was not therapy, it was school. Each alley taught her how to be alone without loneliness, each plate of food how to savor a moment that wasn't a performance. She documented everything with tiny photos and brief notes, small evidence of a life being reclaimed one frame at a time. When she returned home, she carried more than souvenirs. She had a new rhythm, photography class enrollment confirmations, a stack of postcards she'd written to herself, a plan to learn Italian phrases before the next trip. Her confidence did not explode, it grew steady and patient, like a plant finally watered. The confrontation that came next was inevitable and dangerous, their return from the ruined trip. Violet watched their taxi pull up as if cataloging a museum exhibit. They looked tired and thin with embarrassment. Her mother's explanations spilled out, canceled bookings from shady vendors, poor planning, humiliation, and they expected Violet's shame to be the adhesive that would bind the family back together. But Violet met them with something else, a refusal to be the glue. Standing on the porch with her coffee mug like a shield, she listened to their complaints and let the words fall. They were angry at the inconvenience, at the exposure, at having to steer their own ship for once. Lauren's indignation tried to pass for injury. Violet's response was small, precise, and devastating in its simplicity. "You chose her," she said. "So I chose not to be the insurance policy." Her parents sputtered. Her father attempted reason, her mother shifted into apology mode. But Violet's boundary was no longer negotiable. She explained, gently but with a firmness that surprised even her, that her cancellations were not spite but consequence, an adult lesson about respect and reciprocity. The conversation escalated tears, accusations, pleas, until pieces of their old family script frayed beyond repair. They demanded repayment. "You could have left us stranded," her mother hissed. "You could have simply told us how you felt instead of ruining things." Violet's face was still. "I told you." For years. The exchange left raw edges, but it also unearthed buried threads of accountability. Her mother's eyes flooded once, shame finally penetrating the practiced armor. Lauren's face, however, held more irritation than remorse. The familial dynamic cracked, not catastrophically, but in ways that changed the architecture of their interactions. After they left, the silence in Violet's house felt different, no longer complicit but purposeful. She put out a framed photo from her trip on the mantel, the painter she'd met, fingers speckled with color, smiling in a candid, unposed way. The image felt like an argument and an invitation, a proof that she had stepped out and was still whole. The climb toward the climax had not been a shout but an accumulation, a steady rearrangement of priorities. The weight of the confrontation left her exhausted, but something steadied under the tiredness, an internal compass that pointed toward a life she would design. The stage was set for the emotional breaking point, the moment where restraint would yield to consequence. The night the family reunion happened, it felt less like reconciliation and more like a tribunal. Violet's parents had arranged to meet, her mother's attempt at a measured apology, her father's attempt at reason, Lauren's attempt at salvaging dignity. The house smelled of nostalgia and burnt coffee. The table was set with extra places, as if ritual might repair what had been broken. Violet sat at the head of the table with a posture that looked less defensive and more resolute. They began with small talk, awkward and thin. Then conversation dug deeper, the way a shovel finds roots. Old grievances surfaced, birthdays overlooked, promotions downplayed, Times Violet's presence had been assumed rather than celebrated. Violet did not catalog these as ammunition. She presented them like evidence in a case she no longer wanted to prosecute, but needed them to hear. "You could have just told us," her mother said finally, voice edged with that weary, pleading tone she'd used all her life. "We didn't mean to hurt you." Violet inhaled. The breath filled the room. "If you hadn't meant to, you would have asked me first," she replied. "You made the choice. You chose Lauren." Her father's face crumpled into a map of regret. "We thought you thought what?" Violet interrupted, and for the first time her voice did not wobble. "That my needs were optional? That my sacrifices were invisible? Look at me and tell me I've been invisible." Her words hung in the air. The house that had once swallowed her complaints now echoed back with the weight of truth. Lauren's shoulders tightened. "You always take everything so seriously," she muttered, but even her dismissal sounded small. The conversation fractured into fragments of apology and defense. Her mother's tears were honest but late, and her father's remorse came with a tired resignation. For Violet, the climax was not a dramatic, cathartic shouting match, but a slow, crystalline unraveling. The family had to confront the cost of their choices. She steered the dialogue without cruelty. She asked for specifics, small changes she needed for their relationships to continue, genuine check-ins, invitations that weren't assumed, acknowledgement of effort. When Lauren finally spoke, it was not a scripted apology, but an awkward, raw admission. "I didn't think," she said. Her voice was thin. Confession had stripped the edges of her entitlement. It didn't erase the past, but it shifted the balance. For the first time, Violet felt grief that was not only anger, grief for years of being background, grief for the part of her that had swallowed silence to keep the peace, but also a fierce, bright relief. Her mother reached across the table and touched Violet's hand. The gesture trembled with apology and the hope for repair. Violet felt the contact, and for a heartbeat a softer script tempted her, reconciliation like a warm rug. But she had been operating with a different currency now, boundaries. "I won't be the only one responsible for making things right," she said. "I won't clean up after you, emotionally or otherwise. If you want me in your life, it will be with conditions, respect, notice, and reciprocity." Silence followed her statement, weighty, necessary. They had to decide whether they could accept a daughter who would now ask to be seen. It was a hard choice for them. It was liberating for her. The climax closed not with everyone's forgiveness, but with a pact of honesty. Her parents promised to try. Lauren said she'd make an effort. None of it sparkled with instant perfection, but it was real. Violet left the table carrying the strange, luminous mixture of sorrow and empowerment. She had demanded to be recognized and received a start, not a finish. That night she opened the journal she'd begun in Italy and wrote one line, "I choose myself." The pen trembled, but didn't stop. The word choose felt like a hinge. It meant that the door could open again, but only on her terms. The months that followed were quiet revolutions. Violet's life rearranged itself into a pattern that honored her newly declared priorities. She took a photography class and found that framing a moment, light through leaves, hands at work, made her feel less like a background character and more like an author. She answered her parents' calls on her terms, sometimes with warmth, sometimes with distance. The lines she drew weren't barriers to affection, but guardrails that preserved her energy. Her family's apologies were not instant cures. Her mother forgot sometimes and asked, as if nothing had changed. Her father stalled in old habits. But they tried in small, uneven ways. Her mother began calling to ask about Violet's week rather than to instruct. Her father showed up at a photography exhibit. Lauren made tentative efforts, texting photos instead of assuming favors, asking before making plans that included Violet. None of these acts were perfect, and Violet accepted that progress is often small and messy. Violet also discovered pleasures that had quietly existed beyond the family drama. A favorite cafe she now visited without guilt, a group of hikers who taught her how to read mountains like weather charts, and the painter from Florence who became a friend she could call at odd hours just to compare sunrises. Her passport accumulated stamps that were less about escape and more about education of self, of how to sit in a city and be content with her own company. One evening, weeks after the confrontation that had split and mended parts of their family, Violet received a short, tentative text from her mother. "We're trying. Thank you for standing up." Violet stared at it for a long time, feeling the familiar tug of old guilt. She replied slowly, choosing her words as if they were delicate glass. "I see you," she wrote. "Keep showing up." The reply came hours later. "We will." It was small, and it was something. At home, she hung a photograph above the mantel, the bridge in Florence, rain-soft, with a painter smiling into the frame as if she'd always meant to be there. The image was a reminder that joy could exist independent of other people's approval. It hung between two family portraits, deliberate and bold. Violet's relationship with herself deepened into something steady and humane. She learned to refuse when asked for one thing and give another. She learned that saying no did not make her unlovable. It made her consistent. She learned that wounds heal not by ignoring, but by tending, sometimes with conversations, sometimes with distance, sometimes with quiet travel to places that taught her new metaphors for living. When her parents called for a holiday months later, Violet negotiated a plan that felt fair. Shared responsibilities, explicit roles, and, crucially, alerts when plans changed. They had to agree to check in and not assume. The family sat down, less theatrically now, and planned with care. It was not a fairy tale reunion. It was adult work. On the morning of that holiday, Violet packed her navy suitcase, the same one that had held her old dream, and added a smaller, new duffel for herself. She zipped it with a calm that had nothing to prove. As she walked out the door, her mother hugged her without plastered cheer. It was an honest embrace, a small victory. Violet drove away with the radio low, the road ahead open. The city lights softened behind her, and for the first time she felt her life was not a ledger of favors owed. She was writing new entries, little acts of custody over her own time and heart. The future felt uncluttered enough to imagine more trips, more classes, more unarranged breakfasts. She had not erased the past, nor did she want to. Instead, she had learned to hold it without being consumed by it. On her rearview mirror hung a tiny photograph, a snapshot from Florence, laughter, rain, paint on fingers. It was a talisman. When she glanced at it, she felt a fierce, quiet joy. She had chosen herself, and the world had stayed, imperfect and patient, on the other side.